Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I'm joined by my colleague and co-host Gordon Chang. We're going to pay much attention to Asia tonight. There's trouble in the Chinese economy. More to the point, there's a fresh threat from the PLA. I know this sounds fantastic given all the troubles we have in the Middle East, but the threat is about joint exercises pending between the United States and Japan. Gordon, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, John.
Did I read that correctly, that the PLA regards Japan and the United States, two allies, engaging in exercises in the Pacific as a strategic threat to the People's Liberation Army? Is that accurate?
Yeah, you read that correctly, John. And this is at a time when the Chinese have essentially invaded India in Ladakh, and also have now intruded on Japanese waters around the Senkakus. This is just incredible, John.
We will speak much of this Indian incursion and also of the question of whether the PLA is in a good shape enough to threaten the United States Navy and its ally Japan. I mention quickly because this is also a conversation piece that will be later in the show. Information about one of the suspects in the Boston Marathon, that's Tamerlan, the deceased brother, indicates that he was entered into two different government watch lists in 2011 prior to his trip to Russia. Two different watch lists. One of the requests came from the CIA. That is after the FBI decided that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was not a threat. This is the beginning of an investigation into what did we know and when did we know it about a man now deceased who's regarded, along with his brother, as a mass murderer using a terror weapon. There's no additional information right now, but this is sensational enough. We turn to the Chinese economy. Because, Gordon, it's long been your opinion that the weakening and stuttering of the Chinese economy creates the conditions where bellicosity and aggression comes from the Communist Party.
Yes, because, the Communist Party for 3 decades has based its legitimacy on the continual delivery of prosperity. And when you don't have prosperity, the party falls back on nationalism, which means increasing friction with its neighbors.
We're joined now by our colleague Fraser Howie, the co-author of Red Capitalism, the Fragile Financial Foundation of China's Extraordinary Rise. Fraser is in Asia right now. Fraser, a very good morning to you. The preliminary HSBC China Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, which is an important gauge in any country, but this applies to the Chinese, fell to 50.5 in April compared with 51.6 in March. That doesn't sound profound. However, this joins other statistics that Gordon and I discussed a week ago to say that there's softening in China. Is that a fair summary of where we are this morning? Good morning, Fraser.
Good evening to you, gentlemen. I think that's a very fair summary. As listeners to this program would know, myself and Gordon have been very cautious on any sort of recovery or rebound in the Chinese economy. And earlier in the year, we had a couple of good sort of months or a good statistic here and there, and people got all excited again. But the reality is, as these numbers start to show, as time just passes, that there is no real strong recovery in the Chinese economy. There was certainly a slowing growth last year, and it may have halted to some extent, but there is pretty anemic growth in the Chinese economy, and the idea that somehow China is going to lead us out of this just general period of slow growth is just not true. China is suffering as much as any other country, and in some ways it's suffering more because actually its efforts to promote growth have been tremendous. There's been a huge amount of credit going into the economy, and yet the output is pretty weak.
Yeah, Fraser, this is incredible when you think about it, because in the first quarter of this year, new credit was $1 trillion US. That follows new credit in the fourth quarter of last year of like $600 billion. You put that all together, this is an incredible amount of money that's gone into the Chinese economy, and growth in the last quarter was pretty anemic. When you start looking at electricity statistics, manufacturing surveys, price indices, corporate results, you see an economy that's growing about 2 to 3%. You put all that money in, you get no growth. The question is, what's going on here?
A lot of it's, well, I think a lot of this new credit is actually what's happening is it's going into basically rollover loans which were made in the past few years. So effectively you're propping up zombie companies and zombie loans so you don't have bad assets on the bank balance sheets. The credit that is going into sort of new development is in industries which have overcapacity, so you're not getting the productive return. And basically China is not, there is no China miracle. China has not breaking the laws of economics, and ultimately China is coming off a high. It's the growing pains, if you like, of economic development, and China has to realize that the growth rate is now going to be substantially lower going forward, and that in fact they're going to just cause themselves more problems down the road if you just keep rolling over loans and your credit numbers go higher and higher without getting the economic return.
And something that's really interesting that we don't focus in on, people say, well, if they're growing at 5.5%, which is what China bull Stephen Green said for last year, people say 5.5% is good. Well, first of all, it's not 5.5. Last year was probably in the high 3s or low 4s. But the point is, if you look back at 2009, 2010, we're talking about an economy that was legitimately growing at double digits, probably more than the National Bureau of Statistics was saying. And now we have an economy that is growing at 2 and 3%. The deceleration is the real story.
Fraser, do you see this in the emerging markets? You're in Singapore, and you're surrounded by countries that have done very well, economies that have done very well, because China's been their customer the last 5 to 10 years. Is there a slowing there?
There is to some extent. There's certainly no longer the froth and the bubble atmosphere that you got on the back of China. And you're seeing that in Southeast Asia, you're seeing it in Hong Kong, and I think you're seeing it in many places where the Chinese have been investing or where have been, and you're seeing it in the luxury sector as well. So any place that has benefited in the past 5 years from the Chinese boom is starting to see it need not necessarily collapse, but people are reining in expectations. They're not necessarily as hopeful as they once were. Just one, coming back on Gordon's point there about where we've come from on growth. Everyone for years just looked at the growth numbers and didn't worry too much about the credit. If you go back 5 years, you go back to our 05, 06, even 07, the Chinese economy was probably growing at double digits when the total credit every year created in the economy was maybe 20 to 25% of GDP. You've now got an economy that's growing much, much lower, where total credit is now at 30+%, sometimes as high as 40. And if we annualize the first quarter, it's at 50% of GDP. So it's not just the growth that's coming down, but the quality of that growth and the credit that's needed to drive it has just skyrocketed.
Gentlemen, I want to introduce an issue that may not come to more than storm clouds, but certainly it's in front of us. A 53-year-old Taiwanese man, I'm reading from Bloomberg News Report within these last hours, tested positive for the latest strain of avian flu. This is H7N9 after a business trip to the eastern city of Suzhou. I hope I say that correctly, and returning to Taiwan via Shanghai. Minister of Health Chun Wan-ta said at a briefing in Taipei yesterday. First, Fraser, are there concerns about this particular outbreak, the possibility of human-to-human contact? Is Singapore making any defensive moves at this point?
Not that I see. I was in Hong Kong as well last week, and Hong Kong's always been on some degree of high alert at the airport about fever and getting your temperature checked, basically, and that goes back a decade from the SARS experience. But there's certainly no panic yet. I think the numbers are still relatively low, although clearly the number of fatalities is pretty high. You've got a mortality rate officially of around about 20% on this. So it's certainly a very serious disease, but at the moment, the numbers are still relatively low. I think because there seems to have been greater transparency than in previous cases, and certainly compared to SARS. Panic hasn't started yet, as it were, but I'm sure it will come if the numbers increase. But we'll just see.
Gordon, just a thought here. Suzhou, I read from Bloomberg, is located in China's Jiangsu province, where more than 20 cases of the new bird flu have been reported. The country has tallied 109 infections. We've been watching this for several weeks now. It continues to grow. That means that the officials have not completely surrounded the issue, and this is not an accurate account.
Yeah, they have not been able to do that. And you can understand why, just because of the nature of bird flu. The problem here is that there does appear to be human-to-human transmission, because about 40% of the people who have been infected had no contact with poultry. This is going to be difficult for officials to deal with. They're handling it much better, as Fraser says, than they did with SARS. But nonetheless, this is a very difficult thing. You've got to remember, this is a country where we saw 20,000 pig carcasses in the river that runs through Shanghai, and all of these dead bodies that have been floating through the Yellow River.
Gordon Chang of Forbes.com, and we thank Fraser Howie, co-author of Red Capitalism, The Fragile Financial Foundation of China's Extraordinary Rise. Certainly a softening in the Chinese economy is sufferable, but an bird flu outbreak out of hand is pandemic threatening to the globe. I'm John Batchelor.